This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Today we look at another September 11th. It was 40 years ago this week, September 11th, 1973, that General Augusto Pinochet ousted Chile's democratically elected president, Salvador Allende, in a U.S.-backed military coup. The coup began a 17-year oppressive dictatorship during which more than 3,000 Chileans were killed. Pinochet's rise to power was backed by then-President Richard Nixon and his Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, Henry Kissinger. In 1970, the CIA's Deputy Director of Plans wrote in a secret memo, quote, "It's firm and continuing policy that Allende be overthrown by a coup. It's imperative that these actions be implemented clandestinely and securely so that the USG, that's the U.S. government, and American hand be well hidden," unquote. That same year, President Nixon ordered the CIA to, quote, "make the economy scream" in Chile, to, quote, "prevent Allende from coming to power or to unseat him." After the 1973 coup, General Pinochet remained a close U.S. ally. He was defeated in a 1988 referendum and left office in 1990. In 1998, Pinochet was arrested in London on torture and genocide charges on a warrant issued by a Spanish judge, Baltasar Garzón. British authorities later released Pinochet after doctors ruled him physically and mentally unfit to stand trial. Last week, Chile's judges issued a long-awaited apology to the relatives of loved ones who went missing or were executed during the Pinochet dictatorship. This is Judge Daniel Urrutia.
We consider it appropriate and necessary. We understand for some citizens, obviously it's too late, but nothing will ever be too late to react to what may happen in the future.
The relatives of some victims have rejected the belated apology and called for further investigations into deaths and disappearances during the dictatorship. Chilean President Sebastián Piñera said the country's courts had failed to uphold the Constitution and basic rights.
The judiciary did not rise up to their obligations or challenges and could have done much more, because by constitutional mandate, it's their duty to protect the rights of the people, to protect their lives. For example, reconsidering the appeals which they had previously massively rejected as unconstitutional.
Meanwhile, on Sunday, thousands of Chileans took to the streets of Santiago to mark the 40th anniversary of the military coup and remember the thousands who disappeared during the brutal regime that followed. This is the president of the Families of Executed Politicians group, Alicia Lara.
40 years since the civil military coup, the issue of human rights, the violations during the dictatorship are still current. This denial of justice. There are more than 1,300 processes open for 40 years. For 40 years, continuing the search for those who were arrested, who disappeared, who were executed without their remains handed back. Why don't they say the truth? Why don't they break their pact of silence?
Just last week, the wife and two daughters of the legendary Chilean folk singer Victor Jara filed a civil lawsuit in U.S. court against the former military officer they say killed Jara almost exactly 40 years ago. Victor Jara was shot to death in the midst of the 1973 U.S.-backed coup. First, his hands were smashed so he could no longer play the guitar, it is believed. Jara's accused killer, Pedro Barrientos, has lived in the United States for roughly 2 decades and is now a U.S. citizen. Jara's family is suing him under federal laws that allow U.S. courts to hear about human rights abuses committed abroad. Last year, Chilean prosecutors charged Barrientos and another officer with Jara's murder, naming 6 others as accomplices. Well, today we'll spend the hour with the loved ones of those who were killed under Pinochet and the attorneys who've helped them seek justice. First, we're joined by Joan Jara. She is the widow of Chilean singer Victor Jara. She's the author of an unfinished song, The Life of Victor Jara, first published in 1984. We welcome you back to Democracy Now!
Thank you.
It's great to have you with us and in studio here in New York as victims and those who have worked for justice in Chile gather for this 40th anniversary of the September 11th coup. Talk about the lawsuit you've just filed.
Well, this lawsuit, which is by the Center of Justice and Accountability, it's a civil lawsuit, but our aim is not to receive pecuniary, because this doesn't help at all. It's to reinforce the extradition petition, which was approved by the Chilean Supreme Court and is now in United States territory. It's somehow to support that and to appeal to public opinion here in the United States. We know there are many people here, on repeated visits here. I have met so many friends who have condemned the coup on the 11th of September 1973, and I appeal to all the people who have listened to Victor's songs, who realize, and for all the victims of Pinochet, that they shall support and appeal to your own government to realmente reply positively to this extradition request.
After break, we'll also be joined by your lawyer to talk more about the lawsuit. But describe what happened on September 11th, 1973. Where were you? Where was Victor?
Yeah, well, we were both at home with our two daughters. There was somehow a coup in the air. We had been fearing that there might be a military coup. On that morning, together, Victor and I listened to Allende's last speech and heard all the radios who supported Salvador Allende falling off the air as he one by one and being replaced by military marches. Victor was due to go to the Technical University, his place of work, where Allende was due to speak to announce a plebiscite at 11 o'clock. And Victor was to sing there, as he did. And he went out that morning. It was the last time I saw him. I stayed at home, heard of the bombing of the Moneda Palace, heard and saw the helicopters, machine gun firing over Allende's residence. And then began the long wait for Victor to come back home.
And how long did you wait?
I waited a week, not knowing really what had happened to him. I got a message from him, from somebody who'd been in the stadium with him. Wasn't sure what was really happening to him, but my fears were confirmed on the 11th of September, on the 18th of September, Chile National Day, when a young man came to my house, said, "Please, I need to talk to you. I'm a friend. I've been working in the city morgue. I'm afraid to tell you that Victor's body has been recognized because it was his was a well-known face. And he said, you must come with me and claim his body, otherwise they will put him in a common grave and he will disappear." So then I accompanied this young man to the city morgue. We entered by a side entrance. I saw the hundreds of bodies, literally hundreds of bodies that were piled up in what was actually the parking place, I think, of the morgue. And I had to look for Victor's body among a long line in the offices of the city morgue. Recognized him. I saw what had happened to him. I saw the bullet wounds. I saw the state of his body. And I consider myself one of the lucky ones in the sense that I had to face at that moment that what had happened to Victor, and I could give my testimony with all the force of what I felt in that moment, and not that horror, which is much worse, of never knowing what happened to your loved one, as happened to so many families, so many women who have spent these 40 years looking for their loved ones who were made to disappear.
Because he was so well known, there have been many stories about his death. Some said because he was this famous folk singer, guitarist, his hands were cut off. Others said they were smashed. How did you see? What did you see when you saw his body?
This is not true. There was this invention of myths that people, I suppose, thought would help. The truth was bad enough. There was no need to invent more horrors. Victor's hands were not cut off. When I saw his body, his hands were hanging at a strange angle. His whole body was bruised and battered and with bullet wounds. But I didn't touch his hands. It looked as though his wrists were broken.
How long had Victor played guitar? How long had he been singing?
How long he'd been singing? Since he was small, he didn't really learn to play the guitar until he was adolescent, but his mother was a folk singer and he learned from her, yeah.
And how did you meet?
We met because in the University of Chile, Victor was a student in the theatre school. I was a dancer in the National Ballet, but I also gave classes in the theatre school. That's how I met him. He was an excellent student. He was at least the best of his course. But we actually got together later, when I was recovering from when I was sort of ill, and he heard I was ill. He came to see me with a little bunch of flowers that I think he took out to the park because he was penniless.
And you had 2 daughters together?
No, not together. My first daughter is actually the daughter of my first husband, whom I had separated from, but she was very, very small when Victor came to see us that day. He was only a year old, slightly less than a year old. And she always felt that Victor was her father, and Victor always felt that she was her daughter. Sorry, I'm not used to speaking English. So they were very, very close.
And the hundreds of bodies you saw in this morgue, how many of them were identified?
Can't tell you that. This particular young man who worked in the identification civil registry, I don't know what you call it, he was overwhelmed with what he had to do. I can't tell you.
Were you able to claim his body and bury him?
I was one of the lucky ones. I was able to claim his body, but we had to take it immediately to the cemetery and inter it in a niche high up in the back wall of the cemetery. There could be no funeral, and after that I had to go home and tell my daughters what had happened.
We're talking with Joan Jara, the widow of Victor Jara, and we're going to continue with her as well as her lawyer. She's just brought suit against the man she believes was responsible for his murder, among others. We're also going to be joined by Joyce Horman, another widow of the Coup. Her husband, Charles Horman, American freelance journalist, was also disappeared and killed during the coup. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. It's been 40 years since the September 11th, 1973 coup that overthrew the first democratically elected leader of Chile, Salvador Allende, who died in the palace that day as the Pinochet forces rose to power. Stay with us.